And we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm here today again with my good friend, Jared Farmer. Jared, would you like to start off by introducing yourself once more?
I'm Jared From. This is weird for me again with the introductions. So, what do you want me to say? Just I have degrees and stuff.
Yeah. I need to, if you're going to be a regular feature of my channel, I'll put you in the description of the channel or something. I don't know. We'll find some way to work it out.
Okay, so do you want me to go through it again now, or
Sure, go for it. Tell everyone who you are.
uh, oh, that's a tall order. Anyway, what some of the things I've done? Let's do that instead of who I am.
There we go.
Um, some of the things I've done, I suppose, I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy from the University of Illinois. I have 2 masters in theological studies from Emory University, Candler School of Theology. I have 2 other master's degrees from Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California, one in philosophy, one in religion. And I'm currently completing my PhD at the University of Münster in Münster, Germany.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on, Jared.
Sure thing. Sure thing.
So, we're going to talk about postmodernity tonight. As always, for the 2 of you who are watching it, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We'll set a priority for questions. Try to get those answered. But I have a few questions I'm going to lay out, but I kind of want us to start like as big picture as possible. Jared, how would you define the philosopher's favorite pastime, right? How would you define postmodernity? What is postmodernity?
Well, the issue with postmodernity, of course, is if you're going to talk about post something, you have to talk about what is post of, right? So
Right.
the issue is what is modernity? And like all definitions in philosophy, it's a matter of opinion, right? It's contentious. And so part of the issue is the definitions themselves. It's not as though Webster's provides us the best inroad into the discussion of these things. So I think that let's begin with a brief. Let me say that postmodernity is the period. Modernity, I should say, is the period in which progress itself becomes a virtue. Now, to unpack that, we have to think about the context in which modernity arises. And most people, when they discuss modernity, really begin with the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, particularly in Germany and France. French Revolution, culminating kind of in the French Revolution, the work of Immanuel Kant in Germany. But I think that you should really move the scale back further. So I think that what we think of modernity, at least in its early stages, emerges from the cultural situation that was created during the scientific revolution, the tail end of the Renaissance, the age of discovery. So you're talking 1500s, you have the discovery of the Americas by Europeans. And of course, what we mean when we talk about discovery, of course, is discovery in the consciousness of Europeans that there is another continent populated by people who are not white and are not Christian. And what that means conceptually, how you understand the world as just opening up. The same thing with respect to, the discovery of the telescope and the microscope are a big deal. So all of a sudden there's this whole seemingly infinite world of infinitesimally small things that you didn't previously know existed. And there's this world of the heavens, right, which becomes much bigger and also more complex. And all of these things have to be seen as expanding our conception of what the world is.
Yeah.
Right. And then, of course, with technology, you have Gutenberg's movable type printing press, which I want to say was 1450, was kind of the, it was roughly 1450 that there was a movable type printing press, which now allowed books to be much more accessible. Some of these things are actually related too. So if you think about it, Gutenberg's printing press made literacy much more feasible. So more people have access to books, therefore literacy rates go up. People who cannot see well need to read better. And so there actually becomes a boom in technology around lens creation, right? So people can have better spectacles so they can see better. That means better and newer telescopes and microscopes. So as people experiment with lenses, different sizes, different grades of lenses, then they start pointing them at things other than pages. So that's where, you can see things further out and closer up. This, of course, begins with military technology, but as in all military applications, it eventually finds its way into, everyday usage. And so all of these things are working in tandem together to make the world turn upside down quite quickly. And anyone who's taken a Western Civ class knows that the expansion of literacy, access to new ideas, help foment things like the Protestant Reformation, I should say. So like there had been numerous attempts to reform the church prior to Martin Luther. Why is Martin Luther the case that worked instead of, say, Savonarola or John Wycliffe, right? Part of it had to do with the ability to get popular literature out, right? So Wycliffe didn't have the reach that Luther had. Savonarola did not have the reach that Luther had. And so there was no effective means to combat the expansion of the church. But that changes with the Protestant Reformation. Now, all of this moves along, and as it moves along, the new, the novel, the next discovery becomes this expectation that people have in the culture, right? That just around the corner, there's the next new thing, the next new discovery. And this starts to saturate the culture to where eventually it culminates, right, with these ideas of infinite progress, infinite perfectibility that you see in the Enlightenment.
Let me add a few notes.
Jump in there.
Before we continue
clarify,
on.
And
No. I think it's as Jared was saying. It's if you think philosophers are argumentative, just ask a group of historians when modernity started and watch the argument unfold. Right? There's a lot of stuff happening, and any explanation we're going to give is going to obviously gloss over certain aspects of it. But one of the ways that I try to explain it, because I teach a lot of like introduction to world history A and B, right? Or world history 1 and 2. And I have to try to explain this to people who don't care. So I have to reduce it to its like most basic elements. But like one of the ways that I explain it is that one of the characteristics of modernity, which kind of building off what you said, this opening up of the world, societies and civilizations become a lot more porous. Is porous the right word? Malleable, interconnected, right?
Both work.
Yeah. I mean, this starts off by being focused largely on the West, right? When we talk about the beginning of modernity, that conversation typically starts with Western colonialism, the Age of Discovery, which kind of starts that opening up, right? The West connects more with sub-Saharan Africa, and then more directly to Asia. And then, of course, like you said, the discovery of the New World. Another thing we see dealing with this idea of it being porous is mass migrations of people. Oftentimes involuntarily, such as the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of people forcefully relocated. And when you're talking about forced migration on that scale, it's not just the movement of people. Of course, it's also the movement of culture, ideas, language, beliefs, all that good stuff. The other aspect of it, going more to more like intellectual history, I guess would be the right word, coming out of the Renaissance. This is what I wanted to ask you about. With modernity, there's this sense, and kind of getting into this idea of progress. With modernity, we have this sense of not doing away with, but going beyond our past. We're no longer beholden to the past. Specifically, with modernity, I think we get a more prominent rejection of the standard philosophers, i.e., Aristotle, mostly, right?
Ostensibly, at least.
Yeah, in all areas of thought. So, or in the case of the Reformation, kind of the past there being not so much Aristotle, but the Catholic Church or the Catholic reading of Scripture and or tradition, and that kind of comes to define the modern spirit, the sense that something new is happening. What was it that Kant says in what is the Enlightenment? Dare to know, right? Have the courage to think for yourself, or have the courage to be yourself, or something like that. Kind of becomes the motto of the Enlightenment. I don't know. What would you say about that? Agree, disagree?
No, I agree. I think, though, when we say like the movement of ideas or whatnot, so there's been a recent book, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the title is The Dawn of Everything. It was a book by David Wengrow and the late David Graeber, who's an anthropologist. Really phenomenal writer. But in this work, they go back and they look that it was really the interaction with native peoples in the Americas really does not get enough attention when it comes to the influence that it has on ideas, particularly key ideas in the Enlightenment, like what is freedom or whatnot. They go through a lot of detail in terms of parsing out the various ways in which interactions with different ways of life encountered by explorers in the Americas and then relayed back to European audiences. And in some cases, just direct interaction, conversations between European thinkers and individuals from the Americas visiting Europe and whatnot, that a lot of times in kind of a Eurocentric manner, the presumption of many historians has been that these are kind of mouthpieces for free thinkers. So, for example, let's say you have Leibniz, and Leibniz proposes this unorthodox idea. Then what white historians of European descent have traditionally said is, oh, this is just what Leibniz wanted to say, but he knew he couldn't say without, some reaction from the church. So he put it in the mouth of a native person. And what Wengrow and Graeber say is, well, actually, a lot of times what they're saying is in line with native beliefs. And so why wouldn't we just presume that a thinker like Leibniz is genuinely engaging with a thinker from the Americas? Like, the only real explanation is racism, right? And racism and this idea that thinkers in the Enlightenment period, if they express any ideas which don't line up with current thoughts about something, then it can be dismissed or hand waved away as, oh, that wasn't their real intentions. They had to write for certain audiences, yada, yada, yada. You see this a lot, like the presumption that everyone in the Enlightenment was an atheist in the way that we think about it, and that any writings about the divine must have been cover to hide from the Catholic Church, things like that. It's difficult to say, well, if that's your tactic, then how can you differentiate between when a person is actually saying their ideas in a straightforward manner versus when they're trying to cover them over? And then it becomes a matter of, well, how closely does this person's ideas line up with mine? It really becomes a matter of, interpretation is what I want it to be.
Yeah. that's almost an impossible task unless you're like really deep into the scholarship of it. I mean,
Yeah, well, you would have to have some sort of hermeneutical principle by which said, so you can take a figure like Kierkegaard, and this is where we should have Raymond on discussing.
He's
You know,
running late. He doesn't get to talk, so it's okay.
he wrote under pseudonyms, and each pseudonym represented a particular worldview, which was not necessarily Kierkegaard's, right? So when you're listening to John the Silent or whatnot, or Johann, John the Climber, these are distinct perspectives that he's representing. You know that they're not Kierkegaard, right? But to play that game with other writers and say, well, this is what they really meant,
Right.
that's very presumptuous. And unless you have a good hermeneutical reason to do so, it really leans into kind of an eisegetical author insert, right?
Mm.
I know we're getting far off topic with respect to this, but I think that it's not unimportant, right?
Right.
To understand these things about modernity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you want to continue down this path, or do you want to get more into what constitutes the post and postmodernity?
Well, there were a few more comments. I would like for us to dwell a little bit more on modernity, just so that way we can give a good contrast to postmodernity. What would you say are some of the hallmarks of modernity? If you can kind of condense modernity philosophically into a couple of like key points or takeaways, what would you? Impossible question, I know, but what would you say?
Well, I think that I can do it in a way which will lead us into postmodernity. So I think that let's talk about postmodernity's critique of modernity, and then we can see what they hold up as characteristic of the modern in a negative light. So let's actually go further back. I'm going to do this in relation to the notion of metaphysics and how this begins with Plato. So let me take a sip of something here first.
Yeah. Mysterious substance.
Could be a second. It's tea, but it looks like whiskey because it's in this glass. But I'll destroy the mystery. I should have been more mysterious, right?
Right.
No. So part of the critique is if you go back to, say, the pre-Socratics, a lot of the discussion. So you have, of course, early scientific discoveries or whatnot, interest in mathematics and geometry in different fields. But there's also this abiding sense in the philosophy of antiquity, particularly going up through like the Hellenistic period or whatnot, an emphasis on wisdom writings, right? And not in like some, self-help way, right? I really hate when like self-help gurus are like quoting like Epictetus or something as though they understand Stoic philosophy. Anyway, but if you go back, there's a real interest in terms of like, how does one lead a good life?
Yeah.
What is a good life? What does it mean to have moral exemplars? And how should one conform one's life to nature, to the universe, to live, not just to have a prosperous existence, but to have a life worth living. And of course, there's different schools which say, well, what's really important is this or that, whatnot. You have the Platonists, you have the Peripatetics, the followers of Aristotle. You, of course, have the Sophists. You have the Pythagoreans. Schools are a dime a dozen in antiquity. But the interest was really about this sort of lived, practical, pragmatic philosophy. That there are elements. So if you look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in book 6, he talks about different forms of knowledge. So you have, for example, episteme, which is like scientific, empirical knowledge. You have praxis, which is, it's come into the English as just what it is, putting into practice. Although in contemporary thought, when we talk about praxis, a lot of times we confuse it with techne, which is another form of knowledge. Techne is like know-how. a knack, knowing how to do something like playing the guitar or fixing an engine, right? It's a technical know-how, which is a type of knowledge which is distinct. Then you have theoria, from which we get theory. That's abstract or contemplative knowledge. And then you have phronesis, and phronesis is practical, pragmatic knowledge. Is how do you put something into practice, right? It's related to praxis, and it's related to the notions of character and will. Now, why mention that? Well, because with Plato, at least according to many postmodern thinkers, with Plato, you have really the abandonment in certain respects of practical pragmatic philosophy. And instead, you have an emphasis on theoretical knowledge, right? So to know the right thing is to do the right thing. And so the emphasis becomes knowing first so that you can do. And then the issue becomes, well, if we can never know definitively, how can we do? And so all of philosophy becomes shifted towards finding the real, right? The really real, the thing hidden behind, right? The whole emphasis of Plato's cave, right, is discovering the truth behind. And this animates Western philosophy, or at least the main courses of Western philosophy ever since, that there's always this seeking after transcendental truth with a big T, right? And then in the Hellenistic period, this gets Christianized, right? So Christianity takes over an essentially Platonic worldview for the most part. Of course, there are other Christian ideas related to other fields of philosophy, but by and large, Platonism gets fused with Christianity, and this becomes the main course of philosophy all the way until essentially the 20th century. Now, part of the postmodern critique is that as this moves through the Enlightenment period, you have kind of a desacralization of a lot of these concepts. So you get rid of God as the big transcendental other, or if you don't fully get rid of God, he becomes kind of a placeholder, right? So you detach all of the omni categories from God, and God becomes kind of just the guarantor of reason, right? He's an external guarantor. That's its only function.
Well, hello, Raymond.
Let's say hey to Raymond real quick.
Ray, you look like you're on a cheap CCTV camera or something.
As long as he sounds better than he looks on here.
Am I grainy or something?
Yeah,
it's like flickering.
Yeah, I noticed that. I don't know what that's.
Looks like a hostage situation.
Blink Morse code, Ray. It's okay.
Maybe my camera's breaking out on me.
It's all good.
All right, I'm just going to forge ahead while Raymond gets situated.
Okay.
So in the Enlightenment, what you have is kind of a not diminishing of this, but instead kind of a fine tuning of it, so that you get closer and closer. At least the idea of progress is that you're getting closer and closer to this objective big T truth, right?
Yeah.
And so you don't remove this Christian Platonic framework. Instead, what you do is you just desacralize it, you secularize it, and then you continue on trying to get closer and closer to really objective, concrete knowledge. And then it gets connected to the empiricism of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution or whatnot. And then it's kind of a paring down, a refining in certain respects. And then you lose all of these other kinds of knowledge as secondary, unimportant. And then eventually all you really have is science will lead us to objective truth. The one objective truth, the theory of everything, which will explain everything, right? Whatever, the number is in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is the meaning of the universe is this one thing. And for postmoderns, the criticism, or at least the criticism of a lot of postmoderns, is to say that when you get to the logical positivists of the early 20th century, you have the absolute apotheosis of this, right?
Yeah.
Nothing matters if it cannot be expressed in a mathematical formula, right?
Yeah. So,
And
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, like, postmoderns, and we can talk about the ways in which they think that this is true, true in a lower T sense. They think that this whole exercise from Plato through the logical positivists is a bust, right? There is no big T truth. There is no real objective knowledge. All knowledge is hermeneutical. It's all interpretive, and knowledge, as we think about it, is not just the expression of a mathematical formula with some sort of magical relation to an objective world, right? That we can infer from sense data, yada yada yada.
Yeah.
Instead, we need to take philosophy back to thinking about more pragmatic matters and actually making it, useful to living beings again, right? Not just trying to have the most abstract ideas expressible in physical formulae or whatnot, which are detached from, if the meaning of the universe is 63, how does that make me get up in the morning, right?
So I did want to add to that narrative, but before, two things. I wanted to bring Ray in, and we did have a question. So really quickly, Jared, you mentioned the word sophist. Nanalu looked it up, and I think they were given a inappropriate definition. I told them we were very offended by it. So really,
Well-
quickly, what is a sophist?
Well,
I don't
I'm
know if
actually
that's
I'm
too
actually going to
inaccurate,
defend them.
Let's be honest.
I'm actually going to defend the sophist, right? So, and I'm going to defend it with respect to like postmodernity. So, sophists were the practitioners of rhetoric, which were the foils in a lot of Plato's dialogues involving Socrates, right? So Socrates would debate professional sophists, and so the way that I explain this to students is this. If you have imagine this, you live in a city state like ancient Athens, and for the landed male Greek citizens, right, you have to take your turn in direct democracy, which means that you're constantly having to negotiate with other people. In such a society, then it's useful to be able to have the skills of persuasion at your disposal, right? And so it was common that part of education was you would learn rhetoric, which is the art of persuasive speech. You would essentially learn lawyering, right? Because you would have to take your turn in trying to convince people to go along with you. And so rhetoric was very important in ancient society, not just the Greeks, but later the Romans and the early Christian period. The sophists were these people that went around and taught rhetoric, and they were reviled by Socrates, at least the Socrates of the Platonic dialogues.
Yeah.
The degree to which that represents the real Socrates, we don't know because he never wrote anything. But they are the foil in the same way in which, if you read the Gospels, the Pharisees come in for a lot of, haranguing, right, by the authors of the Gospels. But Jesus isn't that far off in a hermeneutical sense. His approach and understanding of the Hebrew Bible is Pharisaic, right? It just is. And so it becomes a competition of slight differences, right? And so in Western philosophy, sophism has become kind of a byword for bad philosophy or people who have empty arguments that sound nice, right? Is called sophistry. But going back to, as I said before, postmoderns criticize this whole idea that we could have objective big D truth And so what you're left with is really negotiation, right? Consensus building, hermeneutics, interpretation. And so you go back and you reach into the history of antiquity and say, you know what? The sophists may have not been that far off.
Can I add too, though, that the like reason the sophist, or like the idea of sophistry, became derogatory is because these are essentially teachers, right? Like they're teaching rhetoric, but then they become like, and you can imagine this, like they become enlisted by wealthy patrons to basically just argue whatever they need to accomplish goals that meet their ends, right? As opposed to arguing for things they truly believe in. So that's why Socrates hated them, is because, specious arguments aside, their arguments were in service to some wealthy patron that was just trying to accomplish some goal. And that was just sort of undermining the like integrity of, a philosophical discussion or the democracy really at all in that sense.
Yeah, so I think the best example of this is in the
Which we still
Platonic, the Platonic dialogue, the Gorgias, right? So in Gorgias, Platonic dialogues are usually named after the interlocutor that Socrates is contending with. And in this case, the story goes essentially there's a house party common in Athens, any excuse to get drunk and, rabble rouse. Important people are there, including Socrates, and there's a famous teacher of rhetoric named Gorgias. And Gorgias is essentially so skilled at rhetoric that he's essentially turned it into a parlor game, right? So he says, give me any topic, give me a position on that topic, and I'm so good at rhetoric, I can convince you of any position, right? Give me the abortion debate, pick a side, doesn't matter which side. I'm so convincing, I'll convince you that I'm right. And Socrates in the Gorgias confronts Gorgias and said, all right, let's talk about rhetoric. Let's talk about what you're doing right now. And they engage in a debate about the concept of truth, right? And essentially Socrates says, well, look, if there's no such thing as truth, right, all of these arguments are empty, right? They're meaningless. And Gorgias's response, which you can see is either cynical or just kind of a more contemporary conception of truth, which is, look, Socrates, truth doesn't exist. And if it did exist, we wouldn't know what it is, right? And so the best that we can do is engage in these sort of what you think of as parlor tricks, right? And what you're doing, Socrates, to pick up Gorgias's critique, because it's not often done, right? Usually we're primed to just assume that Socrates is right. But in Gorgias's defense, what he's essentially saying is, what you are presenting as objective truth, Socrates, is no different than what I'm doing, right? If you're convinced that what you're doing is truth, right, what real way do you know that what you're doing right now is truth and what I'm doing is nonsense or BS or whatnot? Now, I think that you can kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Find a middle path here. You can say, well, look, you're never going to find anything remotely like truth if you're engaging in bad faith arguments. Bad faith arguments, which are putting the cart before the horse by saying they're motivated reasoning, right? Well, I want this to be the case, and so I will find arguments to support that regardless of whether or not there's evidence to the contrary. That's what's typically seen as sophism. That's what we generally associate with the sophists. At the same time, we can recognize that there is some truth to what Gorgias is saying, which is that it is well nigh impossible to know what truth is, to define it properly, and to know when we've achieved it. And so we're kind of trying to nail Jello to the wall here, right?
Yeah. No. So Ray, I want to go back to the question that I asked Jared before you hopped on. Everyone's loving your camera. So what I asked was, started off by asking, like, what is postmodernity? Which Jared, I think, rightly pointed out, we have to define what modernity is. And then I asked kind of what do you think are the hallmark features of modernity? Like, if you had to condense modernity into a couple of key points. I do want to talk about the development of science and how I think it played a part in postmodernity, because I was thinking about that before. But Ray, I want to hear your response to this. What are some of the key features of modernity?
Yeah, I heard some of what Jared said, so I'll try not to overlap because I think he probably picked up on the major themes. I would say that it's, God, there's so much that happens at that time. I mean, the three biggest things, I know Jared picked up on the idea of objectivity, hyper-objectivism, massive, development within natural philosophy, which becomes, modern day science, or I guess today's present day science. Definitely sort of a decline politically in the stranglehold that religions have on governments to some extent. Like, that started happening at that point, but that actually comes in from different origins than a lot of people might think too. So we have like the massive moves in Europe to colonize the world and just generally explore. We haven't talked, I don't know if you guys have talked about it on this yet, but I know we've talked about it off stream, about a lot of interesting archaeological and anthropology work that would suggest a lot of our conceptions of freedom that are sort of paramount in democracy came from these encounters with like indigenous cultures and other places who had like very profound critiques of the European way of life. Those origins kind of get overlooked and undermined sometimes because of the nature of colonialism, but and silencing the victors always write history, right? So interesting stuff like that. So I mean, in terms of that, I mean, it's very straightforward, sort of like hyper like investigation into the natural world, discovering that what we know about it, if we use proper methodologies for research, don't jive with historical religious texts, or at least those texts don't meet the standards of explaining everything that we encounter. In concert with the sort of the loosening of religion on dealing out what political authority occurs, as well as just like general expansion and that sort of like European experience of other cultures for the first time. And the negative impacts of all that as well, too. Obviously, like it's not a good experience for most people. Sometimes not even Europeans. So I mean, in that sense, like if you were to like the major trajectories that people tend to talk about is like the sort of like the separation of religion from being kind of the center of the knowledge creating center of the Western world, and the development and sort of origin story of like the scientific method and science and industrial revolution, capitalism, leading up to modern day. So that's like a nutshell, like a really bad nutshell, but a nutshell.
No, yeah.
I think that let me just say this real quick, and then I think you wanted to jump in with some science, history of science addendums. This what most postmoderns critique, this tendency to theory building, right? The emphasis on a unified theory which will describe everything is what most postmoderns refer to as metaphysics. So not metaphysics just in the narrow sense in which is sometimes described as kind of a theory of first principles, but instead this entire approach to philosophy and thought more generally is called metaphysics. It's all trying to find this kind of the root cause of everything, which will then explain everything. And you can take all knowledge and you can systematize it, right? So this sort of system building tendency, really more than anything else, hyper confidence in rationality and a tendency towards system building, I think define more than anything the period of modernity.
Yeah.
And so when you get to something like Lyotard's famous definition that postmodernity is incredulity towards all grand narratives, that idea of incredulity, one, is not getting rid of things, which I'll have to get into when you're done, which is talking about this itself is not proposing a grand narrative, right? The notion of incredulity towards all grand narratives is not itself some sort of stereotypous attempt to create another grand narrative of suspicion. Instead, it's saying that the general confidence that we can achieve this goal, which animated philosophy for the better part of 500-600 years at least, right? Or you can go all the way back to Plato, right? For essentially the entire history of Western thought, this has been the goal. It's been, whether it was Platonic in the theory of the forms, whether it was Christian, whether it was an Enlightenment idea, all of these attempted to explain everything. And this continues on to the extent that this still happens. It happens in kind of popular science. Now, I think that most, especially philosophers of science, especially post-Kuhn, right, don't think of science in this way anymore. But the popular conception of science is still very much modern in this sense.
Yeah, it's a sexy way to sell books. It's really hard to write a book where the title line is, "We don't really know that much yet, but we're working on it."
And what we think we know can't be reconciled with what else we know.
Yeah. We learned something in this lab, but the Swedes have disproved it, so we're still going back to square one. No, I had a quick question. Did you see that, Mike? I didn't know if you caught me in the private chat.
No, go ahead.
Before we turn from this, so this is more me to you guys. In terms of pre-modern, would you say that system building was still largely inherent in ancient thinking, and that the real big difference in the modern period was that system building sort of, I guess we had a new competing system in the form of natural philosophy and then science that basically was just crushing everything with its explanatory power? Or is it really like that profound? I mean, it's profound in the sense that there are like technological occurrences that like just really shaped the world. I mean, if you want to talk about what changed the world in those time periods, like little things like the Gutenberg press probably had a more grand impact on the world than anything else. Things like that had a greater impact than the normal narratives that we get in philosophy, which is what we've been talking about. But just in terms of transitioning, like in demarcating, do you think that the system building was really, I mean, I feel like it was fairly inherent in Greco-Roman and then up into antiquity and the scholastics and stuff like that. The biggest difference being now that with the advent of technology, it got a little bit more democratized. So like the conversations expanded well beyond, the wealth of the church and people who had means to like transmit knowledge. Or not. I could be wrong.
Well, I think that if you go back and you look at antiquity prior, so we're talking about pre-Socratics, one problem we have is that, they only exist in fragments.
That's
right?
True.
So we only have fragmentary, oftentimes quotes of quotes, right? So we don't have a full understanding of what Thales thought, or any number of early pre-Socratic writers. What we have are very small, snippets of thought or discussions about discoveries. I don't see, generally speaking, in terms of what has survived. So let's qualify it and say what we know of antiquity comes through what has survived into the present, and that's probably just a very small fraction. I don't see the same sort of system building in the way. So think about it. Thales, for example, obviously understood mathematics very well. So you have rational thought of a mathematical kind, which seems to exist in a perfectly integrated way with other discursive forms of thought, which we would classify as different kinds of knowledge. But there doesn't seem to be any compulsion to see that these things are contrary in the way that we tend to think of them, right? So mythological thinking stands in close proximity to what we would think of as mathematical or scientific thinking. Now, after modernity, we see these things as contrary. How can you believe in augury and also know that the earth is round because you have done the mathematical formulations? Contemporary moderns see these things as contrary because we are system builders, because we want to see everything as fully integrated. And we tend to see mythological thinking as rudimentary or primitive science. And I think that flattens out and misunderstands other potential ways of seeing the world. And so I think that we have this crutch in modernity where it's very difficult for us to not project back onto ancient peoples, whether it's the ancient Greeks or it's other societies. So you can even see this if you read accounts of mythological tales. One thing that folklorists, especially in the 19th century, found frustrating was they couldn't find kind of a master narrative, a primary telling of a particular myth, right? Hundreds of different variations. They wanted to get to, well, what was the myth, right? What was the foundation myth that all these things are variations of, so that then we can put it in a rational order and we can explain it, right? We want to make myth more linear in our retelling of it too. So if you look at ancient myths, many of them are told in a cyclical manner, which seem to break rules of time and logic. But they only break rules of time and logic if we think of time in a linear fashion. They only break logic if we think about it in kind of a stringent, rationalistic form, the way that we think of it. In other words, all that to say that I think that we are still very much caught, those of us in the West are still very much caught in a modernist framework. It's very difficult to break out of. And any attempts to do so are just panned as irrationalist.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's definitely true in America. America is like its own weird spin-off of modernity. A little still true in Europe, but like Europe has some areas where I feel like postmodernity has made more sense to them.
Well, we can even see this, like, so for example, you have the mythology in the book of Genesis, right? It's mythic writings, right? It always has been. So look at the tendency to attempt to make it science.
Yeah.
So it's not just the apologists, right, and the critics. It's this general assumption that it should be explanatory in a scientific way, and that if it's not explanatory in a scientific way, then it's meaningless, or it's primitive, or what have you. That these people were trying to do science, but because they were so backwards, right? They really thought that the earth was created in 6 days, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
But did they, though? Well, maybe some of them did, right? But obviously not all of them. And that's not even the point, right? The fact that we think of creation narratives as explanatory in a scientific way, the way that we think of it in a contemporary sense, I think is anachronistic.
Yeah.
It's deeply anachronistic to ancient peoples.
For sure is. I mean,
It's
part
so
of the
much-
problem here. Go ahead, Ray.
I was going to say, so much of our like system building comes from like, I mean, Porphyry's tree, Aristotle's biology.
Mhm.
I mean, the Egyptians had, you know, like they figured out time and timekeeping. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm saying like we took it into overdrive for sure, but I feel like it's definitely still there. Like we didn't invent it, is what I'm really trying to say.
No,
Was it
well,
like,
before
was
you
it
came
like-
on, what I said was, you know, the critique of postmodernity for the most part is that, you know, they peg this on to Plato, but that's really just kind of convenience.
Mhm.
He becomes kind of the punching bag. So that all philosophy post Plato is Platonism. In broad terms, not literally, right? It's all metaphysics, it's all Platonism. It's to create this category and say that everything tends in this fashion. And as I said before you came on, it's like it begins here and then it pares down, right? So you have all these other forms of knowledge, you know, phronesis and all, you know, practical wisdom and, you know, emphasis on other kinds of understanding of the world slowly get eliminated as we try to get closer and closer to real objective knowledge, you know, real objective knowledge of a scientific kind. And so we have to get rid of everything that doesn't meet that criteria. And even, you know, our own perceptions, right, can't be real knowledge because they're, you know, dictated by our animality, right? So we have to figure out some way to get outside of our own humanness in order to see the objective world. And what you start to see with Kant, and then this gets picked up by critics of the Enlightenment later. So Kant's important because he's not only kind of a central figure in modernity, but he also becomes a launching point for critiques of modernity with the post-Kantians, right? The Romantics were one of the first, you know, critiques of the Enlightenment from, you know, a sentimentalist perspective, but that's another thing. So Kant has the Copernican revolution, says, you know, the issue is that we don't have access to this objective world in any sense or fashion because we are always going to be constrained by our animality, by our humanness. To see is to see the world as a human being. To understand is to understand as a human understands. If there is a ding on sick, right? If there is a thing in itself out there beyond our reach, even if it's impinging upon us, we don't have access to the thing as it exists in itself. Instead, it's a construction. It's a mental construct, which we create based upon our own perceptions. And this extends even to the realism of like a Russell, right? So Russell's notion of sense data, right? I don't have access to the table in front of me that I'm touching. What I have access to is sense stimuli, right? Electrical signals running to my brain, which my brain then constructs an image of. And I can assume that the table is a table from here because you, who I also perceive across from the room, you tell me that you also perceive the table. And then I have to take that on faith because I'm also assuming that you exist. All these things that we don't have access to the real world. We don't have access to the objective reality. What you do with that becomes kind of a measure of your notion of realness or anti-realness.
Yeah, kind of to that point, one of the things I was going to add, speaking to the modern idea of progress, I mean, I think a big reason why modernity is associated with this like fixation on progress is without a doubt because of the natural sciences. More specifically, I think it almost all falls back on Newton and Newtonianism. Because what happens with Newton is, well, so Newton publishes his Principia, and for the next like 200 years, all of physics becomes building off of what Newton said. And he creates this really, really successful research paradigm that all like subsequent astronomers kind of jump in on and add to, largely because Newton kind of laid the foundation by providing a theory of gravity. And then from that foundation, other people were able to step in and give more accurate calculations about the orbits of planets, the new introduction of new technology, specifically telescopes, allowed more accurate observations, all of which fit in with what Newton was saying. And so in the 17th and 18th century, there was this amongst scientists. Now, common everyday people, no one cared about, right? But amongst scientists, there was this very tangible sense of progress, and rightly so. That combines in the 18th century, starting especially 1750 with the Industrial Revolution. Science goes from being like abstract mathematical theorems about astronomy to tangible, embodied pieces of technology. I don't know why I'm talking like that. To tangible pieces of technology that become widely available to any and everyone.
Just keep painting it in those religious tones. That's okay.
Well, Bachelard has this idea that technology is embodied theory, so that's where I got it from.
It's a Hegelian thing. It's the externalization of itself into an object, right?
No, yeah. So you got Newton. This becomes exemplified for the everyday person post-industrial revolution because technology becomes so widely available. And of course, the industrial revolution brings with it a massive increase, creation of the middle class, massive increase in wealth all around. And so poor people are able to actually afford these things for the first time. It also brings with it a huge disparity gap between rich and poor. But, I'm glossing over that to kind of feed into this. And so by the time the 19th century rolls around, the everyday person is seeing tangible signs of the progress of science in the form of transportation technology, the advent of the automobile, the steam engine, which is applied to boat and rail technology. People are, moving away from walking in the case of poor people, horse-drawn carriages in the case of rich people. Transportation becomes easily and cheaply accessible for people. Electricity by the mid-19th century becomes available in major cities throughout Europe and the United States.
Mostly free.
What's that? Yeah. Mostly free or freely accessible to all these people. And so there's a very real sense by like 1850, 1860, that civilization, that humanity as a whole is progressing. And it's really easy just to point to the signs of that. Now, I think two big things happen. What I'm interested in is the breakdown of mathematics that starts to happen in the 19th century, the inability of mathematics to explain certain things. Microparticles, first of all, and orbits and development of non-Euclidean geometry, but that's like super highly specialized. So ignoring that, the other major thing that happens, of course, early 20th century is all of that technological progress, all of that scientific progress, all of that feeling that society is moving forward, humanity's moving forward, goes out the window with the advent of the First World War. In which, so if before people saw like the tangible applications of science in everyday life, now they saw the flip side to that. They saw what this sort of technology was capable of, And with that comes the very real sense that this could end, or maybe this wasn't a great idea. And the same with World War II as well. So to me, that science is the motivator of modernity in the sense that it gives us this very strong narrative of progress, but it's also what that's also where the cracks first start to form, so to speak, with the issues of modernity, that maybe this progress is maybe there's issues with it. Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the wheels kind of fall off, but it's because you have this faith in technology, but human beings have always been wolves to human beings, as it were. But it's technology which allowed for trench warfare, right? It's technology which allowed for the atomic bomb. Never in human history has genocide at the scale of the First and Second World War been possible without technology. So technology becomes not a good in and of itself, but we start to recognize it as a tool which can be used to our benefit or our detriment. But ultimately, technology is no better than we are. And then we have to turn back in on ourselves and say, well, what have we become, right? Which is the reason why existentialism takes off, in the interwar period. And then after, the Second World War, especially.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also interesting to say that, if you go back and look at the Enlightenment critique of religion, for example. So think about the rationalist period in terms of textual criticism of the New Testament specifically. You look at a figure like David Friedrich Strauss, who's an important German New Testament scholar who wrote a very important book called Das Leben Jesu, The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. And that work is about 1,400 pages in the original German, and it is a meticulous critique of the historical and scientific claims of the New Testament. Devastating at the time that it came out. Epochal. One of my favorite quotes about it is, I think it was Anthony Ashley. I could be misquoting who said this, but my favorite quote about it is the most pestilential book ever vomited out of the jaws of hell. Oh, to have such a blurb on one's book, right?
Right.
So to say that it was not received well, I think is an understatement. But the point is, the textual tools that were created to systematically deconstruct a worldview like the kind of Christianity which was prevalent in 19th century Germany, those tools didn't just go away once, Christianity of popular religion was discredited. Eventually, those tools get turned back in on themselves, right? So the Enlightenment critique of the Enlightenment, you see with the beginnings of it with someone like Nietzsche, right? So Nietzsche was trained as a textual critic at the Forta School before he went on. So Nietzsche never had a job as a philosopher. He was a philologist professionally. He was a classicist. All of his training, all of his formal school training was in classics. And he knew how to take, the Portmanteaus, right? Read it in the original languages and deconstruct this very, all of the parts and try to, engage in redaction, criticism, whatnot. Well, what happens when you take that sort of meticulous, fastidious criticism and you apply it to the assumptions of the Enlightenment? You have the same sort of devastating critique, right? That these things are shot through with assumptions and holes, right? And that's where you start to see the postmodernity, right? When people started to take the tools of modernity and to question their own assumptions and beliefs. And then they found that ultimately they were wanting as well.
Yeah. You want to add to that, Ray?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't really have anything much about postmodernity. It's a weird thing. It's on the one hand, it's just a reaction to modernity. It's a frustrating reality because most of the time, like the famous postmodern thinkers don't really have anything helpful to offer up. Go ahead, just deconstruct everybody's world. That's great, but like you're not. That's like why like science has become like so. I mean, it's essentially just a religion at this point. Like there's just so much demonstrative power and like practical use in like science. Um, it's got its own cult following, which is why you can create, popular philosophy, science books, or, why scientists can just start doing philosophy and be celebrated as like good thinkers, even though they've never been trained in it. And typically only regurgitate things that have already been settled or have already been spoken. But I don't know, like there's no, like, it's the downside of it all is that postmodernity didn't have like really, I mean, there were some thinkers, right? But a lot of them didn't have really good insight into what to do next. And most of them failed to think like, hey, we've got this big scientific, ability. Maybe we should actually put it to good use instead of, valorizing people who are trying to go to Mars. Like, I'm not against that. Like, I'd love to live on Mars for at least visit it. That'd be awesome. But like, can you imagine the problems we could solve like IRL with people around the world if we just stop fucking around with like stupid technology that is great and helpful if all you want to do is like explore at the detriment of like the rest of society? But it's just, and that's a common critique, and I think an unfortunate reality of the pushback against modernity, because the other aspects about modernity that like definitely don't get talked about a lot is like those more humanizing aspects, right? Like it wasn't that people lost faith in technology, it's that people lost faith in humanity. Yeah. That humanity would like do this to other human beings, like that we would so abandon like our like sense of like right and wrong and like just like loyalty to the species, that we would just fucking wipe out an entire like civilization or like an entire ethnic group because we had the technology, right? Meanwhile, we could have probably been solving like real world issues for a lot of other people if we'd been so damn greedy and somebody had been there whispering into the scientist's ear, like, maybe this shouldn't be invented. Maybe you should stop working on how to create projectiles that can kill people and, like go try and solve like a plumbing issue in your adjacent neighborhood or, like just little things. It's just unfortunate. Like that. It's just like we had this new, like strong-minded child come into the world with no guidance because like postmodernity just like kicked everything out, and like what vestiges of modernity were like attached to it were basically just evil. So
not a fan.
Deeply dissatisfied. And
I'm gonna come to postmodernity's defense.
I hope we can push away from postmodernity and move on with human existence in a good way, but I don't know if it'll ever happen.
I think that, so part of the issue, I think, with the tendency to criticize postmodernity, it's a bit like criticizing a meteorologist for the weather. Postmodern theorists are people who are attempting to say something meaningful about the shape that, culture has taken. And they're diagnosing, as it were, the problems in modernity. And to the extent to which they don't offer solutions, gets back to this rejection of certain modernist ideas, which is to say, well, part of the problem was we were we were tinkering so much with humanity as such that we were, not living. We were manipulating the world. We were manipulating ourselves, and that the focus should not be on these sorts of technological solutions to the problems that we've created. If the problem is humanity, then what we need to do is focus on the human side of it, right? The humanities in the traditional sense, the human sciences, This is why we need to go back to practical values. We should go back to phronesis through, a study on creating the sort of people who won't create nuclear weapons just because they can, right? That if we had, there's no necessity in science as such that technological innovation will terminate with the creation of nuclear weapons. So, Mike, what's the I could be wrong. Is it the Fermi, or it says essentially like the any society which reaches a certain level of technological innovation will probably have created nuclear weapons and destroy themselves before they can contact other sentient beings on other planets?
You may have been thinking about the Fermi Paradox or the Drake equation. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it's called the Great Filter. I don't know who came up with it.
So the problem I have with things like this is the issue with science. The issue with science isn't science itself. There's nothing wrong with science, obviously. The issue is when science becomes the only tool that you have to explore the world. It's the old adage about if you only have a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. If the only tool that you have at your disposal is science, the only methodology you have for problem solving, then all problems become problems of science, right? Values go out the window, other ways of conceptualizing things. And then science is itself value laden, right? It's shot through with all sorts of assumptions and values. And science, for the most part, doesn't see that. They're transparent to science itself. And you can use this as an example. Why would we assume that a technologically advanced society would be a self-destructive society? Only because we see ourselves as the only model, right? Because Western technology eventuated in genocide and nuclear bombs, the presumption that any possible society that could exist and have technological innovation will likewise terminate. That's based on all sorts of value-laden assumptions. That's not a scientific hypothesis. That's a presumption. And to the extent to which people aren't self-reflective about those sorts of assumptions, right, then that's where this becomes a mental prison, where you cannot think of alternative possibilities. It's the same thing with, the assumption that any technological society will terminate in Western capitalism, right? Well, read anthropology. Human societies are infinitely malleable. It's only because of globalization and the destructive, compelling power of capitalism that we have forced this way of life onto the majority of the world, right? But there's nothing necessary about it. We've organized ourselves any number of ways throughout human history, and we can, and if we survive, likely will organize society on different foundations at some other point. There's this awful tendency to look at the last couple of thousand years, presume a Western perspective, anachronistically project on to this narrow understanding of history that we have, the values of the present, and assume that everything has been leading inexorably to the present moment, such that our society is the highest in culture, the highest in technology that could potentially be fulfilled. So any society has to take this trajectory. It's all sorts of historical assumptions there, all sorts of values. And the issue with postmodernity is to try to remove some of these threads and say, we don't have to think this way, right? We need to diagnose how we came to think this way. And in so doing, we need to find other ways of thinking about the world, because otherwise it will be self-fulfilling prophecy. We will destroy ourselves if we continue on the path. You know, the path that we have found ourselves on has led to ecological disaster. It's led to, you know, the sort of Damocles hanging over our head in the forms of nuclear war, right? Obviously, a meteor could hit the planet tomorrow and destroy all life inexorably. But never before until modern times have human beings had the capacity to destroy all life on this planet through ecological disaster and nuclear war. And that's come about through technology. And it's come up, and that's not to say that technology is bad, it's to say that technology is a tool. And if we have a different sort of culture, a different sort of society, then we will use our tools differently. There's just nothing necessary about the way that we have structured society. Human beings can change it. We've created it in the first place.
And that's the seed of the frustration that, you know, I have, and when I push back on postmodernity. And just to push on your metaphor a little, at least when the meteorologist tells me rain is coming, they tell me to grab an umbrella, right? There's a solution that they propose, as opposed to just, I don't know, not having any like that. I think like the struggle that postmodernity has as a framework, if you can even call it that, because it's kind of antithetical to, is that, you know, like you have this powerful systematic opposing force, not even opposing per se, but something that demonstrates clearly that you can create capital T truths. I mean, like, you may not believe that gravity exists, or you may not have a framework for talking about it, but on a basic level, like, human beings 10,000 years ago knew that if I jumped off a cliff, I was probably going to die. So, like, I don't know. I feel like it's not a perfect perspective, and it doesn't truly deconstruct everything that I think a lot of people think it deconstructs. Like, I think you gotta take postmodernity with a grain of salt, and recognizing that it should add some humility to your systematization, but at the same time, like, it should be more, and there are postmoderns who think this, like, I think that, you know, that's more about looking at competing systems and making sure that we're evolving them, as opposed to picking one and sticking with it, you know, without any sort of, like, just sort of on faith, like, we should just stick with this system because that's what we believe in the face of clear, like, antithetical, like, evidence, or, you know, other systems that might provide a better framework. But
yeah, well, that's where I think postmodernism gets a bad rap, and, you know, probably has its own self to blame for this. And I'm speaking of postmodernism as it's a coherent whole, but they're individuals. I mean, the postmodern critique of science, I think, on one level has its place. And Jared, if you need to go, that's okay. We can. Yeah. Thanks for coming. We'll do this again soon.
All right. Thanks, guys. Good night.
Yeah. Peace. But yeah, like, on the one hand, there are, like, legitimate postmodern critiques of science. So what I have in mind here are things like Foucault's Birth of a Clinic, right? In which Foucault offers, I think, legitimate criticism of the ways in which clinical psychology evaluates things like mental disorder. Like, by pointing out that there are cultural aspects to what we consider to be, like, inappropriate behavior. Like, that's fair. Where it steps out of line is obviously because it's so, like, blatantly counterintuitive, is when postmodern thinkers will say things like, you know, there's no such thing as, like, scientific truth, or that we can't know anything about reality, or that science can't, you know, reveal aspects of nature that other disciplines can. I mean, that's when it gets like you've gone off the rails.
Yeah. Okay. Jump off the building, buddy. You know, let me hear you speak about no factual, like, no truth at all. And so, like, just, like, come on.
Right. I mean, to say that, and this is where the idea about like progress comes in, right? So because so it's one thing to object to the idea of like progress as a whole, or that like scientific ideas progress. I mean, this was in France, Fourier's explanation of the Enlightenment, and then of course like Thomas Kuhn's scientific revolutions. But even though Kuhn objected to the idea of progress, there is some sort of progress that's made in the systems themselves, in the descriptions themselves, right? So it may not be that science is moving closer and closer to the truth. So the classic example of this is the shift from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian relativity, right? Einstein radically changed some of the most basic concepts that Newton utilized, such as time and space, right? Ideas like fundamental to Newtonian thought. But what Einstein did was change how we think of that in specific ways. So it's not that Newtonian mathematics is wrong. It still works, right? Gravity is still a thing, but it's that our understanding of what gravity is and how gravity relates to the structure of space-time has gotten more refined, right? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think and we don't talk about this enough. I talk about it a lot because, my roots in like 1700 German thought, but it's a question of relative versus universal and how we understand them, right? Like in the relative context of living on Earth and experiencing Earth, gravity in that way has a context of meaning that doesn't necessarily apply to the entire universe in the same way that we would think, right? And in that sense, it's universally applicable, which is something that like the postmodern doesn't like, right? Because in certain regards, like a cultural understanding of something isn't universally applicable. I'm not saying that ancient peoples had a word for gravity. I'm just saying that at some point, every human being is confronted with a height or confronted with a wild, mammalian predator, or the anxiety associated with looking out into like the abyss of the ocean, anything like that just makes you feel like infantilely small, like incapable of like surviving great feats and tragedies. And that like like you can explain those phenomenon with science. It doesn't eradicate the fact that people may have had a different understanding of the experience of those things, but it doesn't invalidate the legitimacy of like the principle and its universality, right?
Right.
You don't know what to call it, right? Like when I forget what it's called, like when you walk outside and you sneeze because of some effect on how, like when you see the sun, like look at the sun, it causes people to sneeze. I don't remember what it's called, but I know there's like a medical term for it that they've rooted in like a legitimate causal thing. But somebody in the past may have just said like, like every time I see the sun, I sneeze. It doesn't invalidate that truth. It's just a different type. And they're not necessarily mutually contradictory. So I don't know. It's just a weird thing.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, I've heard a lot by, I can't say they were postmodern thinkers. And to clarify a little bit, I think this more so has to do with the how specialty knowledge is passed down to like the general population and how that can sometimes lead to misunderstandings. But I remember taking a class at Emory in which we were reading some postmodern thinkers, and the professor in the class, like one of the justifications for this person's position hinged upon like Einsteinian relativity, and the professor's comment was, well, Einstein made everything relative. Right, which is not true. So like, and maybe this is part of where some of the confusion is coming from, because when where relativity gets its name from is the relativity of the observer in relation to the event, and the measurement of the time and the place that the event's taking place in. Right. That's what Einstein means by relativity, is the measurement of time, not the relativity of truth.
Yeah. No. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Ray, I did want to, and maybe we can close out on this.
Yeah.
It seems like some of your language you need to be more careful with. Shame on you.
Science is a religion.
Because you called science a religion. I think we have some confusion here. Now, I gave what I thought might be your explanation, but you tell me, like, what did you mean by that?
It's very simple. It would be like he said, little religion, not big religion. I mean, there's definitely a world. So science in the sense of like capital S, not like the method or the scientist per se, right? Not the procedure or even oftentimes the pursuit, but the sort of sheer willingness to put aside any self-critical evaluation of a scientific statement, quote unquote, or principle, and just trusting in like authority blanket, there are bad scientists like there are bad anything. Like, don't just trust mindlessly in it. But we're in a point where science has had such like a yeah, I agree, Dr. Ideri. There is a certain level of faith in science, and it only gets more dramatic the more demonstrative power it has. Which I'm not saying you shouldn't have faith in science. I'm just saying you shouldn't, trust, a scientific study in, a CNN blog post or something like that, or you just like it's become a following, and it has its own. I mean, you can writ large. It has its own rules. It's an institution. It has its own. You can almost say tithe. Like, I mean, there's a lot of money associated with good scientific research, and that's one of the biggest issues with what's happened in modern and postmodern world, is that what drives scientific research is oftentimes the incentive for some company or somebody to make money from it, as opposed to driving it for things that people actually need. So,
did I get the gist of what you were saying right in my comment?
No, yeah. Because you have like Elon Musk celebrities and
right,
who are praised as like these Iron Man, right? Who's like this billionaire genius scientist, right? Who can invent or do anything.
And maybe I was reading too much into it, but it's kind of sounded like what you were saying was one of the defects of postmodernity. Once you get rid of grand narratives, we got rid of, and this is a exaggeration, right? Because religion's obviously still around. In fact, it's still the majority of what people believe in. It didn't go anywhere, and it's only gotten stronger, right? But once you get rid of postmodernity's idea of denial of grand narratives, well, in its place comes science, which appears to have a grand narrative. And so, when you said that science has become a religion because it's one of the few grand narratives that people still have left to kind of put their faith in, so to speak. I don't know. Didn't want to.
No, absolutely. I mean, even just look at the celebrity scientists and the titles of their books. I mean, the whole idea of a theory of everything. I mean, how could that be any more religious in undertones? I mean, it's metaphysics. Like, dude, like it's, I don't know, like maybe somebody could do it. I don't think it's possible. I think it's the wrong question and the wrong pursuit for science to try and come up with a theory of everything.
Yeah. Darren, I have some issues with this statement, but I'll come to your office, your virtual office on Monday to have this discussion.
It doesn't necessarily, no, and I mean, order is not really a factor in it at all. If anything, modern science has pushed back on, that's the big struggle with, Einstein's revolution versus Newtonians, right? Is that it just completely destroyed our perceived understanding of the order of the universe, right?
I'm just kidding, Darren. I'm just really trying to get you on to come join us in our conversation, and you keep turning me down. So, yeah, I'm just going to start calling you out. in the comments. Just messing. Ray, anything else you want to add about
in
postmodernity?
response to Nanalu's question, I don't think it's order. I think it's measurable. That things can be measured is necessary for science, not necessarily that they're orderly.
Yeah, I think measurement's key there. We'll do another episode on the philosophy of science for sure.
Yes.
All right, Ray, you want to close us out on postmodernity? Final thoughts?
I feel like we're at this point. I don't know what the next thing is. I don't think anybody really has a clue of what the next thing is. I don't know if it's a retreat. I know that there's people who want to retreat to the classics. And that's a very common thing. I don't particularly like it in the way that it's being done, because it's a moralistic retreat as well, an ethical retreat, which means that, it comes with all of the issues of exclusivity and a lack of equity. I mean, it's great to read the ancients and learn from them, but we should also recognize that, to be a part of a democratic system in Rome meant you had to be a citizen, and that was not a very large portion of the population that lived there, including slaves and oftentimes women, people of other races. So, it's not a negative note. I just don't know if anybody has a clear view of where we go next as far as philosophy goes. There's just always retrenchment in old things, and the state of the education system right now is really tough. There's no there's no great space for experiment like there used to be in the 1900s and 1800s and previous. So maybe technology will make that a little bit more affordable and easier to accomplish, which I want to talk to you after this about an idea I had. But
okay,
appreciate the comments. Everybody's got great insight here. I wish I could respond, but I can't. I can read them, but I don't have a text box to write back, as far as I know.
I'll show you how to do it next time. You have to open up the YouTube tab on a separate thing.
Oh, okay. Just go into YouTube and do it. I can do that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We will maybe have another discussion next week. If not next week, the week after. So, good night. See you all later.